The scientific study of psychology traces its origins back to the 19th century, specifically to a physicist named Gustav Fechner. He sought to solve a highly specific measurement problem, locating the exact boundary where a physiological reflex ends and a psychological experience begins. Fechner designed an experiment to measure how long an image remained on the human retina after a flash of light. To avoid the slight delay of a test subject verbally reporting the sensation, Fechner acted as both the researcher and his own test subject. This data visualization plots Fechner's resulting mathematical formula, S equals C log E. It maps a logarithmic relationship showing that physical stimuli grow along a geometric curve, while the human sensation of those exact same stimuli only grows arithmetically. This equation proved that mental states could be quantified. Following Fechner's lead, subsequent researchers began focusing entirely on measuring isolated mental phenomena, like perception, memory, and attention, rather than investigating the structural nature of the mind itself. Modern psychology successfully built an empirical science of mental functions. It categorized how brains process information, but it entirely bypassed the foundational ontological question: what exactly is the psyche? If you open a modern psychology textbook and look for a definition of the psyche, you will find what is called an enumerative definition. Textbooks define the mind by listing its components: memory, speech, desire, and intention. This tells us what the psyche does, but it avoids explaining what the psyche actually is. Relying on a list of functions creates a structural problem. Without a clear boundary, it becomes impossible to determine if a behavior is a psychological action or simply a chemical, neurological, or physiological event playing out in the brain. To build a rigorous definition, we have to invert the methodology. Instead of looking at mental phenomena, we define the psyche by contrasting it against all the possible non-psychological forces that cause a human being to act. By stripping away our assumptions and mapping the exact boundaries of external, deterministic forces, we can locate the precise space where the mind operates. Every human action, no matter how complex, can eventually be traced back to one of 4 categories of causality. 3 of these have absolutely nothing to do with psychology. The first is physical necessity. If you accidentally touch a burning ember, your hand violently recoils. A single-celled amoeba behaves the exact same way. The action is driven entirely by biological physics. The second cause is logical necessity. These are actions governed by rules that a person freely accepts because the ontological structure of the rule is inescapable. When you pay a $1.10 bus fare, you hand the driver 2 $1 bills rather than 1. You accept that 2 is greater than 1. The action is dictated by the structure of mathematics, not your emotions. The third cause is chance. This describes an outcome determined by a matrix of overlapping variables so infinite and untraceable that we label the result an accident. If you reach into your pocket without looking and pull out the exact coins needed for that bus fare, you are experiencing chance. A massive chain of prior physical events place those specific coins at the exact angle your fingers grasped. Physical reflexes, mathematical logic, and untraceable accidents constantly dictate human behavior. None of these 3 causes require a mind to operate. This diagram illustrates the topological definition of the psyche. We see 3 distinct, rigid circles representing physical, logical, and chance constraints. The psyche is the zone of indeterminacy that exists exclusively where these 3 deterministic forces overlap. The psyche possesses no direct, independent force of its own. It acts entirely by combining these 3 rigid constraints to serve the biological interest of the individual organism. The mind gains agency by intentionally internalizing the limitations of the physical world. As it adapts, it expands its territory, eating into the constraints of logic and physics and converting those limitations into power.
When a child learns to walk, they are submitting to the physical necessity of gravity. By internalizing exactly how gravity pulls on their weight, the child anticipates the fall, adjusts their muscles, and transforms a physical limitation into the psychological advantage of free movement. A healthy psyche is a biological translator of freedom. It expands its agency by mastering and manipulating the deterministic rules of the outside world. If the psyche always operates in the biological interest of the organism, we have to ask what exactly causes psychopathology. This geometric model defines psychopathology as a spatial retreat. The psyche shrinks inward, abandoning its conquered intersection space and ceding control back to the three outer deterministic circles. In cases of severe neuroses, the psyche surrenders its behavioral control back to pure physical necessity. Automatic, involuntary physical reactions expand and override the individual's psychological freedom. Catatonic schizophrenia represents a surrender to unyielding logical necessity. The individual becomes trapped in a paralyzing, rigid logical loop that completely ignores the organism's physical survival. These deterministic states sit in direct contrast to the psyche's true base nature. In its purest form, the psyche is pure potency, a chaotic field of infinite, unactualized possibilities. Mental illness is a measurable loss of freedom. It occurs when the mind abdicates its zone of indeterminacy to the mechanical, unfeeling rules of the universe. To function socially among other human beings, the psyche must impose a fourth limitation upon itself. It must restrict its own infinite potential into a single forward-moving historical chronology. The organism observes its environment, records its experiences, repeated failures, and specific choices, and organizes that data into a continuous, predictable biographical narrative. This continuous historical structure is the ego. It provides the consistency required for an individual to be recognized by society. Forming this coherent identity requires a massive amputation. The individual must permanently close off vast portions of the psyche's infinite potential to maintain a stable persona. If a child repeatedly asks for affection and is ignored, the child eventually stops asking. At that exact moment, the lack of fulfillment ceases to be an external event and solidifies into a permanent structural feature of their historical identity. The ego is a necessary act of self-mutilation. It is a rigid character constructed to wield power in the human world, built entirely by closing doors to alternative possibilities. Once the ego forms its rigid narrative, we have to account for the remainder. What happens to all the amputated potential, the rejected impulses, and the unassimilated chance left outside the ego's timeline? This diagram illustrates a unified definition of the unconscious. The bright central timeline is the ego. The shadowy cloud surrounding it is the unconscious, the vast, discarded remainder of the psyche that the ego excluded to maintain its historical coherence. This topological model provides a single framework that views fragmented psychoanalytic theories as specialized observations of different borders within the same structure. Wilhelm Reich developed the theory of muscular stasis, which argues that repressed emotions manifest as chronic physical tension. His theory locates the unconscious exactly at the border of physical necessity, where random casual impossibilities are converted into hard physical blocks. Sigmund Freud's theory of repressed desire focuses on the ego's self-imposed border. He mapped the internal impulses and rejected biological drives that constantly threaten to destabilize the historical narrative. Viktor Frankl developed logotherapy, an approach centered on the human search for objective meaning. Frankl realized that psychotherapy does not treat the infinite psyche. The psyche does not get sick. Therapy exclusively treats the finite, damaged ego. True psychological healing requires the individual to find objective meaning. By rewriting the rigid history of the ego, the psyche reclaims its discarded potential and expands its freedom back into the world.